Hello, I am continuing the series on fear and anxiety with additional practical tools that you may want to use. Let me just adjust the camera a little bit. The last couple of sessions I recorded had to do with using breathing techniques, so a specific way of producing and maintaining relaxation as a means of dealing with stress or fear or anxiety. I thought I would also do a series on other practical means to deal with difficult feelings. And most of what I am about to say can also relate to feelings other than fear and anxiety, but I'll keep it amongst this thread. All right, so well, one of the things that I always say to my patients is that practical advice when it comes to psychology, that there's a lot that is applicable, but that doesn't always have so much to do with the external world. And examples that I'm going to use today also have to do more with the internal world. So, of course, as a psychologist or as a psychotherapist, one has a bias towards experience and in the internal world and how we make sense of the external world. All right. So, the first thing I thought of mentioning would have to do with context. So, when you have a difficult feeling, let's take fear or anxiety as an example, a useful question to ask is, what is the context? So, where and how does this feeling appear? Now, let's use a particular fear as an example. So, let's say fear of the opposite sex. So, an obvious example of that would be whenever one is exposed to the presence of the opposite sex. Now, when I say that, I think it's important to also note that this exposure can be external. So, in my case, if I were to be in the company of a woman, then that is an external context, but also memories of or things that I imagine that had to do with the opposite sex might also be part of the context. So the opposite sex becomes the context in this example. Or, that would also relate to authority figures or snakes or open spaces or whatever you can imagine. Now, first of all, you try to determine the context. If it's an external context, then in many ways it's easier to notice whenever I am in the presence of that object or person or situation, I have these feelings. I want to emphasize again that I think it's important to also notice or try to notice if there is an internal context that either accompanies that or contributes to the unpleasant emotion, the difficult emotion, and that it's well, okay, I'll get back to that, but I think it's very important to pay attention to the internal qualities that contribute to our feelings. A useful question, if that is difficult to determine, the context is, where and when does this feeling not occur? So let's say someone might say, okay, so I am quite anxious, but whenever I am watching a movie, I am not. So, okay, that is useful information. There are approaches that often rely on the fact that when we have fear or anxiety, we have either conscious or we have imagery that we are only subconsciously aware of, or maybe that we might be consciously aware of. So when we can kind of, in a very specific way, hijack the visual cortex using things like movies, television, or even video games or electronic games, it is possible to, at least for a brief period, to short circuit that fear. I'll just go on to, seeing that this came up now in my mind, I'll just explain a little bit more about that. So if you discover that you have a very strong imagery-based kind of fear system going on inside, a useful thing to do is, for instance, last thing at night, or very close to bedtime, or to going to sleep at least, you play a game on your phone. Now, in my experience, quite a number of games might work, but the ones that are often recommended are games that are visually very rich, show colors and sounds, but colors, movement, sound. The sound may be less important in this case, but the visual components are quite important. You don't have to like the game, you don't even have to finish a game, but for, let's say, 5 minutes, maybe slightly longer, maybe even slightly shorter, depending on yourself, you can play that game, you can stimulate your visual cortex through that game, and then kind of, in a sense, override the spontaneous imagery, which will hopefully help you to get a better night's rest, which in and of itself will also contribute to your resilience, or your sense of resilience. All right, back to context. Okay, so there are certain anxiety conditions that we call generalized anxiety that you may find very difficult to identify a context. I think one should really try very hard to identify a context, and like I suggested, to also ask a question, where is it that I do not feel this feeling? Those are important clues and cues as to how one might want to manage your own sense of dread or difficulty. Now, let's say you ask that question and you identify a very particular external context. So, I'm trying to think of an example quickly. Struggling to come up with something. Let's say you have a fear of going to a very specific shopping center. Now, for most people, the first line of defense is almost always avoidance. Now, of course, you can avoid a shopping center if you have alternatives available, and or somebody else can do your shopping for you, or you can do online shopping, which is easier these days. If it's a context like you're scared of other people, it becomes a lot more tricky. If you are scared of the opposite sex, it becomes a lot more tricky. So there are certain fears that lend themselves to avoidance as a measure better than other fears or other difficulties. Now, I think most psychologists or psychotherapists would say to you, look, of course, avoidance exists and there's a reason for it, but it's a very bad long-term solution. It's a very poor way of dealing with a situation, especially in the modern age. You make your world smaller and smaller and smaller, and in your attempt to avoid more and more of the difficult issues in your life, you end up living much less of life, having much less freedom. So avoidance being the first line of defense, one has to recognize that, but then one has to go a little bit further than that and say, okay, so if I were going to try and deal with this particular context, how do I go about that? One of the popular ways, of course, and I think I mentioned this in a previous video, is gradual exposure. Now, gradual exposure, even if it's an external context, does not necessarily mean that you have to sort of throw yourself into the deep end. Sometimes that might work, but I would not recommend that. I think incremental stages is a much more healthy approach, a much more useful approach. So if you're, let's say, terrified of going to a specific shopping center, you may first of all imagine yourself going to that shopping center. Now, if you combine this, for instance, with something like the breathing technique, you can, in a sense, inoculate yourself against at least parts of that particular pattern. Once you have inoculated yourself enough against imagining going to the shopping center, is to maybe get into your car and drive in that direction. So not necessarily going into the parking lot, but driving that direction, feel the anxiety building up, park your vehicle somewhere safe, do breathing technique, for instance. Even if you don't do the breathing technique, just sort of gradual exposure, sort of see how close to the shopping center you might get, and then try to get a little bit closer next time, a little bit closer, maybe eventually going into the parking lot, sitting in the parking lot, driving out, eventually getting out, walking towards the shops, not quite getting there, not quite leaving the parking lot, but having left your car, and so on and so on. I think you probably get the idea. If you combine this with something like a breathing technique, it probably gets a little bit easier, a little bit quicker. The internal context, and I'm going to speak quite a lot about this in future videos, but that it has to do with shifting our imagery, our thoughts, our internal dialogue. And again, it is important to notice that almost every experience will have both an internal and external component. As human beings, we are fond of trying to deal exclusively with the external component, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But to my mind, as a psychotherapist, there is a more useful that it is more useful in general to deal with internal components, sometimes only internal components, and sometimes in addition to dealing with the external situation. Alright, so first thing that you want to do then, well, not first thing, but one thing that you can do is to try and determine the context. What is useful about finding a context is to discover that your fear is not everywhere. Again, let's take the other example, fear in the opposite sex. And if you ask the question, okay, so where is this not true? Where does this not happen? Is to discover, oh, okay, so when I am with family, female cousin, or my sister, or my mother, or my sister-in-law, or something to that effect, somehow I don't have the same kind of anxiety. So, okay, that's useful. So, in fact, you are then, using myself as a male as an example, you are not really afraid of all women. So there's something about women who are not these women that, if we can discover that, we can figure out how to go about dealing with that fear. Or, of course, if we discover that there are exceptions to the rule, one can say, okay, so, what is it? Maybe above and beyond the fact that they are family, that makes these women seem safe to me. All right, so I hope that you understand this well enough to be able to use it. Again, as always, please watch some of the other videos as well. Most of the videos are interrelated. And if you find this interesting, please subscribe. If you have any questions in the comment section, please pose your questions, and I hope to at some future stage to come back to you and answer some of your questions. Thank you for your time and attention.